Michael. It's good to see you. Welcome back to the program. Thank you for making the time.
Hi, Bashi. Thank you for letting me be here.
I wanted to start off just on your read of the significance, or maybe lack thereof, but of the meeting that took place in person on the sidelines of the UN between the Premier of China and our Prime Minister.
Sure. It's a significant step, taking advantage, of course, of the opportunity to meet many world leaders at the United Nations General Assembly and debate in New York. So that's a typical thing to do. But the fact that both sides are willing to meet, and I think what we have at the moment is body language and optics and vibes, right? And those were clearly positive from both sides, which suggests a general willingness to improve relations and to stabilize them. And obviously, it takes two to tango, so you need willingness on both sides to do that. But I would not read too much into diplomatic handshakes and smiles. I mean, that's something that every prime minister has to do, meeting every world leader at the United Nations, regardless of what they may actually think of them personally or of their country or of their policy.
Certainly the lines of questioning to the Prime Minister as of late around what happens next with China, it was interesting to hear his answer last night, in particular characterizing the intent of deepening the relationship and trying to sort of position it as on a sectoral or kind of compartmental basis. Like, we can do more on agriculture or climate while still, being aware of other very significant areas of friction. How do you internalize that?
I think that's an accurate description of Mark Carney's government's approach, right? He's looking for opportunities to drive economic growth in Canada, to address problems that we're facing geopolitically, and some of those economic opportunities can come from China. But at the same time, he'll have been well briefed and has experience to know that China is also an extremely challenging country to deal with, even more so today than back when he was a central banker, for example. And so the challenge with trying to take a sectoral approach is that the Chinese themselves don't take a sectoral approach. They always link issues when it's in China's interest to do so. So they will use leverage in one area to extract concessions in another. And so you have to be mindful of that going into negotiations with them, right? A lot of talk around we have to cooperate with China on certain global challenges we face, whether it's stabilizing the global economy, trying to maintain a rules-based international trading system, addressing climate change or public health. There are a lot of global issues. We're not in the 19th century world. All of these things affect everybody on the planet. And so, yes, we have to work with countries that are not easy to work with to try to address them. But that doesn't mean that we can count on the Chinese not to use, for example, green technology or climate change as a point of leverage for something else they get. So the problem is that the party state will instrumentalize everything, and they are very challenging to negotiate with. So sure, by all means, talk to China about these things, pursue Canada's interests, but be very careful about how you're doing it and have very realistic expectations of what you can get out of it.
Like, I guess it's interesting because the Prime Minister has used the word negotiations, and so have some of his delegates when talking about what the future discussions with China look like. Is there any way to consider China a good faith partner in those negotiations, or would that be naive?
Yes, that would be naive. They are not a good faith partner. I mean, it's a fundamental aspect of China's political culture, right? And why it's such a challenge for an international rules-based system, whether you're talking about international law in general or trade agreements or consular agreements specifically. They have abrogated multiple agreements with Canada and with multiple other countries when it suits them. They violated the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. They violated the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and Consular Relations. They regularly abrogate trade agreements or don't honor the spirit of them, for example. The very issue with electric vehicles is a classic example of China trying to use existing trade agreements, but at the same time going around them with an ecosystem that massively subsidizes electric vehicles. So you cannot count on China honoring any agreement you make with it unless it suits the Communist Party to do so. So what you really have to be looking for is an alignment of interests rather than trusting that, well, we signed a piece of paper with them, so now they'll do this, right? That's not a guarantee. And that's a fundamental facet of China's political culture. It's all about power and interests and leverage and instrumentalizing. That doesn't mean that it's not possible to engage in some elements of trade or investment, but you need really, really strong guardrails around them. And ideally, you need to diversify so that you don't create dependence on China in any of those sectors.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to ask, look, I mean, this is all against the wider context of, and we've spoken about this before, but what's happening with the United States and a pressure, lots of it emanating from the business community here to look to China to supplant the market access that we have in the United States. What is the risk of doing that to a great degree? Like if in fact we decide to double our trade with China, for example, which a lot of business leaders are advocating for, what is the risk in doing that and becoming more dependent on it, that country?
Sure. I mean, so two things there. My first response to people who are advocating for that, I would say, which sectors exactly are you imagining that China is going to fill in for the United States? What is China actually going to buy from Canada that the United States is currently buying? Because the reality is that for the most part, those economic complementarities are not there, right? China, you can increase some trade to China in some areas, but in most cases, that's not going to be things that the United States was buying or is threatening to stop buying from Canada. So it's not a useful substitute in that sense. Secondly, the orders of magnitude are just much too unmanageable for that, right? China is a much smaller share of Canada's trade than the United States. So it's not possible for it to substitute for the United States as a partner in a realistic way. What it can do, and here, to my other point, if you think of it like a stock market investor, right? Would you put all your money in two stocks and hope that they both do well? That's not prudent policy for a government or for an individual or a pension fund, right? You want a diversified portfolio. So what Canada should really be emphasizing as much as possible is a diversity of trading partners. Yes, so whether or not you increase trade of one particular commodity or product with China, it's not the absolute increase that matters. It's rather the relative increase. Is that company or is that sector becoming dangerously dependent on China for that? That's what happened with canola. I mean, one of the things that struck me with the canola issue, right, is we've seen that movie before. Yeah. In 2018, after Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou on an American extradition warrant, China slapped tariffs or effectively trade barriers that completely blocked its purchases of Canadian canola. It cost the industry over $1 billion. You would think that there would be some learning after that, that maybe China is not a reliable customer. You don't want to put all your eggs in the China basket when you're selling canola. You maybe want to diversify the crops you're growing and selling, and you want to look for other markets as well, rather than ramping up sales to canola, to China of canola as soon as you're able to again, and reestablishing that dependence, which then, as we've seen in the last year, China has once again weaponized to put pain and pressure on Canada. And canola is a particularly acute example, right? Because what China is trying to do is pressure Canada into lowering barriers to its electric vehicles and steel and aluminum. And that, of course, is a sector that is heavily concentrated around Ontario. Meanwhile, canola, of course, out west in Saskatchewan, Premier Scott Moe just came back from a trip to China about that, right? And so that's not only putting pain on Canada to try to get it to lower the tariffs, it's also driving wedges between provinces and regions. It's a divide and conquer strategy, and I really hope that Prime Minister Carney is able to rally all his premiers together to have a united stance with China on those negotiations and not let Beijing play one province against another to try to weaken consensus. It's a classic tactic. China uses it in ASEAN in Southeast Asia. They use it with European Union members where they try to curry favor with one or two countries and break consensus. That's why you need a strong federal stance with the backing of provincial ministers going into any kind of negotiations.
Do you think it would be a mistake to back down from the tariffs on EVs that are currently in place?
Yes, I do. I think what negotiations on that issue have to focus on is looking for other concessions, perhaps, that Canada could make to get China to drop tariffs on canola, and then reciprocally other things that China could do to balance. So that's really what the negotiations need to be about, right? If it were just a simple, straight quid pro quo, Canada drops EV tariffs, China drops canola tariff and other agriculture food tariffs on seafood and things like that. That's not a very complicated negotiation. But that's not what you want. You want to try to calibrate those concessions that each side needs to make to ensure you're protecting Canadian workers and Canadian industry and also Canadian farm sectors, of course. You're protecting the country, and you're giving a balanced negotiation of the country's interests, and that you're aware of the kind of negotiating tactics and pressure tactics that the Chinese will use to get what they want. The danger of just dropping tariffs wholesale, right? Let's roll the movie forward. What would happen if Canada did just do exactly what the Chinese want? You're going to have increased dependency in Canada's agricultural sector on China. That means the ag sector is going to become essentially a constituency for China within Canada that is going to repeatedly lobby the government to foster that relationship, protect that relationship, and not do anything that China doesn't want Canada to do, lest it once again punish Canada by blocking that trade. So that's already warping Canada's political economy that way. Meanwhile, on the electrical vehicle side, if Canada becomes dependent in its supply chains on Chinese electrical vehicles, that becomes another choke point where China can effectively control and influence Canadian policy. So, and it's not just Canada. Every country these days faces this dilemma. You risk giving up sovereignty and giving away too much leverage to China if you do those things. And in the case of electric vehicles, you risk completely hollowing out the entire supply chain and technological and industrial base of automotive.
I've got to leave it on that note. Michael, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. I appreciate your insights on this 4th anniversary. I can't even believe it, of your release. It's such a wonderful thing to see you here. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here, but it's also a reminder of the challenges of negotiating with China.
It sure is, definitely. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Vashi.